we're going to start on our bedroom renovation. This all starts with a fair bit of demo. In the end, it was about 8,000 pounds of plaster, lath, bricks, carpet, and framing. And we'll also start looking at the design and the details for the room. The house we moved into recently is split into 2 apartments, one upstairs and one downstairs, as you can see here with the 2 front doors. Our plan is to transform the upstairs into an Airbnb apartment, but that means that just about everything needs to be updated. And the first place we'll get started is in the back. The reason we start in the back is because we have a fair bit of furniture that's being stored in the front, so we'll work on one room, finish one room, move all the stuff to that room, and then be able to work on the rooms in the front. So this room in the back will be our master bedroom. This room used to have a closet where the chimney is, just about in line with it, which blocked that gable end window, which brings a ton of light in the end of the day. So our goal was to open up the room completely, re-insulate it, and then refinish it. So we'll have to get through all this lath and plaster, this chimney, this drop ceiling, and remove this carpet as well as the 2 closets that are at the entrance of the room. First thing we'll get started with is removing the trim around the windows and the doors. I'm hoping to save this trim as I'm not sure I'll be able to replicate these profiles with modern trim. So for the trim I'm hoping to save, I'll mark every piece where it came from and pack it all up after I remove all the nails. After removing all the trim, I'll focus my attention to the ceiling. After taking off the roof tiles off camera, I can start taking off the plywood. It appears that the previous owners put in the ceiling to hide some of the plaster that had fallen off. And after that, we start getting into the messy, dusty work. The horsehair plaster is embedded into the lath, the wood lath, which means that the best way to remove it is to create some sort of vibration to separate the 2. For that, I'm using the rotohammer with a angled flat chisel bit, which I'll include a link to in the description. This worked beautifully. It knocked it loose, knocked it off the wall. I was able to pull big sheets at a time. This was a great setup. One of the most important things when demolishing this amount of material is to try and stay organized in the process. So what I do in this case is take off all of the plaster all at once, then figure out a plan for it. And then I'll take off all of the lath all at once and try to organize that. And as you'll see in the rest of the video, this becomes pretty important. The last thing you want to do is make one giant pile of plaster in the middle of the room. This will put a lot of stress on the structure. In this case, we're on the 2nd floor, so that's a real concern. Then I could take out the closets. I try to plan this so that I could take out large portions of the closet all at once and walk them out of the room easily instead of having to break it all up into the pieces. That meant I had to be pretty careful working around the baseboard heater pipes. These were run through the framing, so I had to be careful to cut around the framing around the pipes so that it wouldn't break. And so now I can start pulling the lath off of the ceiling. For this I'm just using a hammer with the claw and pulling the boards off. Once you pull 1 or 2 nails, the board wants to come off. It's got enough spring to it, that way it comes off. And I start pulling the insulation from the ceiling, and some of it still looks pretty good, so I'm hoping to save it and maybe reuse it somewhere. I'm not entirely sure if I will, but I'm saving it just in case. pile in the middle of the room quickly got out of hand once the lath started coming off. And so this was my biggest concern going into this project, was how was I going to get all of this material out of this room without having to bag everything and dump it myself. So what I came up with is this simple chute. I looked at chutes on Craigslist that were really expensive, so I decided to buy a 12-inch, 12-foot long sonotube, which was just long enough to reach this dump trailer that I rented off of Craigslist as well. So I just rigged this sonotube with some simple 2x2s and bracing, and this setup here worked great for the lath because the lath is nice and light and you can just really send it down the sonotube. But as you'll see later, I update the setup for the plaster. The plaster is much heavier and likes to bunch up, and it wasn't quite good enough this way. The angle wasn't quite good enough either. But before getting too far into the cleanup, let's look at the design for this room. So here we are. There's the entire room with the framing and the sheathing on the outside. And let's start peeling back the layers. Taking off the sheathing, then we'll start taking off the plaster. Then we start looking at it head on. Take off the ceilings. And then just for clarity, we'll take off the gables and the existing closets. So the idea with this renovation is to create a bedroom that starts bringing back some of the Victorian details as well as modernizing them. So I thought that the best way to do this was to build a barrel vault in that room instead of just cladding the framing. One of the consideration also is that all of this framing will be insulated with rigid foam, so that may create inconsistencies. And so we'll want to address those as well. So the barrel vault, this is the general geometry that I'm working off of. I don't think it needs to be a semicircle, so you'll see that it comes in at an angle, so not square to the horizontal line, which means that then we'll need to build a shelf that spans this dimension here. So let's kind of start looking at this. This is basically going off of this line. I know that this is my layer of drywall, and this will be my layer of lime plaster. The hope is to create the barrel vault out of lime plaster. The plaster allows me to work out, some of the inconsistencies in my framing, the existing framing, the drywall, this and that. Being able to put a trowel on a surface allows me to flatten it much better than rigid materials could. Unless, of course, you're building a boat, but we're not trying to build an upside down boat in this case. So we'll see some of the furring strips here, and the structure, the 2x6s. The consideration from the geometry was to leave enough room for the furring to clear the existing framing. Then a beam comes in, and then here are templates. This is more clear from this view. So these templates will sit, and attach to the rafters as well as our 2x6 nailer. It's almost could be considered a ledger in this case. And then the same happens here as well. The reason this one is floating is because it attaches to the face of the gable wall instead of the rafter. But then the furring strip can run. This allows me to run a 12-inch on center nailing pattern for the drywall, which will allow me to hold it much tighter to the frame than if it was bent on the ribs. So the drywall comes in, and then the plaster. We'll also build 2 new closets with pocket doors, and we'll clad everything with a 1x12 shiplap, and then we'll have some finishing details. And then here's a few shots from the other side. And you see that shelf gives us an opportunity to carve a little groove to put some LED track lights that will shine up at the dome, the barrel vault. So let's get back to our giant pile. As you can see, I'm able to get through this pile fairly quickly with the chute set up out the window. I was able actually to get through the entire pile in a day by myself. Then the next day I could start taking down the chimney. The mortar for the chimney is, over 100 years old, so it's very brittle at this point. So it really doesn't take a whole lot of force to take down each brick. But what you'll want to do is carefully brace the chimney as you work your way down. Because as you clear the structural braces, the existing structural braces, you'll find that the chimney wants to tip over on its own. So you have to be careful with that, because as tempting as it is to just push it over, it would come through your floor probably. And then the only other step is to take out the carpet. And so for next week's video, we'll start framing and fixing some of the framing, as well as running our electrical rough-ins, and then the whole room will get insulated. So thanks for watching, and get back to work.